So we'll be continuing the lesson with colonization in India, looking at indirect control, which is a method of how a country controls another, but not directly, as the name implies. So we looked at the spread of colonization as it was linked to imperialism by different countries. So who here can tell me which countries we looked at? Yeah, that's right. So we looked at Britain and France in particular. And obviously our focus at the moment in this unit is Britain. So we'll continue with that for now, and in particular on India for today. So we want to examine how does a country like Britain, very powerful but also quite small, control one of the biggest countries in the world with many times the people, that is India. So that's what we'll be looking at. Now, remember, each lesson for this unit shouldn't just be seen as separate, it's all part of a unit. So at the end of the year, especially during exams, you want to be able to link all the ideas together. So imperialism, the effect of it, colonization, how it was controlled. I want you to not see each lesson individually, but see it as a unified whole. And that's also part of one of the curriculums that we talked about last week. So it's identify links between events to understand the nature and significance of causation, change, and continuity over time. So the effect of colonization, imperialism would spread, over many decades, sometimes as much as a century, sometimes even longer. And I want you to keep in mind each lesson we do all kind of links together. So keep that in mind as we go through this lesson. So just to go over it again, who can remind me exactly what imperialism is? Yeah, that's right. So imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through colonization, use of military force, or other means. When we're looking at India, it's a bit of a mix. So yes, a superior military technology is used to establish their dominance, but then once they're in the country, it's not particularly that they're doing everything through intimidation or through military. It's a lot of indirect control. And so indirect control is basically when a country rules another, but not all through their own people, right? So Britain is using Indian people, often princes or people who already had power, to rule the class. So it's a symbiotic relationship, so that means both benefit. It's not that the Indian princes, for example, were merely puppets. They kept their power, and sometimes they even got more power because they had the influence of the British, but they also had to help the British. And this reduced the work for the British as well. So instead of sending their own people there who had to do all the work of controlling, they simply worked through the already established power systems there. Of course, some Indians, if they got too resistant or didn't comply with the British people, could be removed if necessary. But when possible, Britain preferred to keep already established leaders in there. So those were Indian people who already had the power, already had the means of controlling the Indian population. One of the central figures for colonization and imperialism, especially British imperialism, was Frederick Lagarde. So he was considered the pioneer of indirect rule. He started in colonial Africa, and he was really established a set of ideals or beliefs when it came to how to rule a country through indirect control. And he defined indirect control as rule through and by the natives. So like I said earlier, it's not we come in and we tell you what to do, it's they come in, establish their dominance, but allow already established leaders to continue ruling. So they don't replace the king with their own British king. They keep it could be king, for example, in Africa. It would be princes, for the most part, in India. They keep the Indian princes there, but also direct them how to, particular things they want them to do. It was also used by the French to control parts of their colonial empires, particularly in Africa and Asia. And it's also not just the people keeping the structure, but also keeping the same power structures that are already there. Royal families, for example, caste systems, things like this. Local leaders is another example. And how they did this is they clearly didn't have more people than India, for example, but they had superior military technology. So they were able to coerce leaders by saying, this is what we can do with our technology. You cannot beat us in battle, so we won't continuously use our military might on you, but if you disagree with us, we will. The other important thing to keep in mind is indirect control is much easier and it's much cheaper to rule a country than to send their own people in. It's much more costly to do so. And in fact, Britain could not possibly completely rule India without some form of indirect control, simply because there's too many people. So British Asia was the biggest example ever of indirect control. So how many British do you think were in India ruling over them, and how many Indians do you think were ruled over? Not quite, actually. Only fewer in 1890s, fewer than 1,000 administrators were ruling over 300 million Indians. So less than 1,000 British people were basically, through indirect control in India, ruling over 300 million people. So it's a pretty staggering number, but it shows you just how effective indirect control can be. And the other thing to keep in mind is, even within the military, more than 2/3 of British troops in India were actually Indian. So they assimilated the population. And as we talked about last week, part of the reason for colonization and imperialism, the spreading of influence, is you get resources. So they were able to bolster their army through the use of Indians, Indian conscripts joining their army. So it's another motivation for why they would want to control India. And just because I mentioned it earlier, an example of different rulers in different places that were used in indirect control. In Morocco and Tunisia, they were ruled through Arab monarchs. In Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, indirect control was used through kings. In India, there was a mix. About 30% of the land was princes. So that's kind of, in each case, they kept the particular ruling system that was already in place through indirect control. Just briefly, this is printed out on your sheet. This is a picture of a Yoruba, which is Nigerian, depiction of a British officer. So you can see in the photo it has a white British officer on a boat full of wealthy Nigerian princes, rulers. So what we can kind of take from that is they're all in the boat, so they get to kind of keep the power as it is, but it's very clearly ruled or directed by the white officer.